Good evening. I'm David Lair, President of Community Advocates, Inc., the co-founder of these conversations, the America at a Crossroads virtual town hall. This is the fourth in our virtual series and the 16th since Community Advocates and Jews United for Democracy and Justice started the programs 3 years ago. From Congressman Adam Schiff to Bret Stephens, from Jennifer Rubin to Ambassador Mike McFaul, to a dozen other distinguished Americans, our lineup has really been extraordinary. Our co-sponsors include ICAR, Leo Beck Temple, Stephen Wise Temple, Temple Israel of Hollywood, Valley Beth Shalom, and the Jewish Center for Justice, as well as the Forward newspaper. Community Advocates was founded in 2002 by Mayor Richard Riordan, the late Joe Hicks, and me to speak honestly about tough issues. Jews United came into existence in 2017 in reaction to incendiary actions and words by President Trump on too many issues to list. It is headed by the indefatigable Janice Kaminer-Resnick, whom you will be hearing from later, whose enthusiasm has inspired her fellow executive members, former Congressman Nell Levine, former Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky, Rabbi Ken Chasen, Caroline Kelly, and me. Tonight's program deals with a critical issue that has not, until recently, and especially the last few days, received the attention it merits: voter suppression and the effort to limit the American electorate in November. It is an issue that strikes at the very heart of our democracy. Tonight, we have with us three distinguished experts on the topic, each with impressive credentials. You will be able to pose questions using the Q&A function on the bottom of your Zoom screen over the next hour. However, with an audience approaching 1,000, we can't guarantee that your question will be asked. Tonight's moderator is Val Zavala, a longtime friend and multiple Emmy award-winning fixture in LA television for over 30 years. She was a reporter, anchor, executive producer, and vice president at KCET, our public television station, where she hosted SoCal Connected and the long-running Life and Times. Val?
Hello, this is Val. I'm back here now moderating. Apparently, we've had a little bit of trouble with our video, and so we're going to go ahead with the program. I hope you perhaps have all had a chance to see the documentary. Maybe that's why you're here. It is superb. It really shows the groups who are on the ground trying to reveal and discover voter fraud. In essence, what they find is that there's very, very little of it, but they are adamant and they're, somewhat fanatics about finding it. So we're going to go ahead with our discussion, and hopefully you will have all seen, or definitely will see, the documentary soon. I'm going to begin by introducing our panelists. Matt Keller, he is co-executive producer of RIG, the Voter Suppression Playbook. Keller retired from Goldman Sachs and Company in 2002, where he served as the head of worldwide mergers and acquisitions, co-head of investment banking, and a member of the firm's management committee. Apparently he had a little bit of a change of career after he retired. He's a graduate of Harvard College and Harvard Law School. Also with us is Professor Gilda Daniels. She serves as an associate professor at the University of Baltimore School of Law. She's a nationally recognized voting rights and election law expert. She served as a deputy chief in the Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division, voting section under Clinton and Bush administrations. She has 2 decades of litigation, negotiation, and consulting experience in the substantive voting rights area. She is author of Uncounted: Voter Suppression in the United States, NYU Press, published in January of 2020. Welcome, Gilda.
Thank you.
Also with us is Professor Richard L Hassan. He is Chancellor Professor of Law and Political Science at the University of California, Irvine. Hassan is a nationally recognized expert in election law and campaign finance regulation. He has op-eds and commentaries that have appeared in many publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, Political, and Slate. One appeared just today in the Washington Post. His newest book, Election Meltdown: Dirty Tricks, Distrust, and the Threat to American Democracy, was published by Yale University Press in 2020. Kirkus Reviews said the book should be required reading for legislators and voters. Welcome, all of you, to our discussion. Don't worry, I want to tell our audience, don't worry, we will absolutely talk about the effect of the pandemic and COVID-19 on elections, but first, I want to let you know that the documentary covers many different aspects. It is, after all, a documentary about the playbook. It covers gerrymandering, voter ID laws, purging voter rolls, reducing voting opportunities, creating false fear about voter fraud. These are all tactics that groups from the right are using to suppress voting. So I want to ask our panelists, of these various tactics, which one do you think is the most effective in suppressing voters? I want to start perhaps with Gilda.
Interesting. Thank you so much for having me tonight. Really happy to be here. When you ask which one is the most effective voter suppression tools, I certainly argue that they're all very effective. And I think that's one of the mistakes, if you will, that we make is by focusing on one tool versus the other. Because if you live in certain parts of the country, you are constantly forced to deal with and certainly respond to a restricted voter ID, polling place closures, right? Voter purges, felon disenfranchisement, right? All of those things are happening at the same time and affecting certainly members of communities of color at a very at a disproportionate level. And I think that all of those issues are very important and are very effective. We can certainly see historically how certainly things like the poll tax was very, very effective. In places like Alabama in the early 1900s, instituting the poll tax meant that 140,000 African-American men who were registered to vote was reduced to approximately 40 because of measures such as the poll tax. So certainly white supremacists during that period in the early 1900s thought that the poll tax was going to be a very effective tool. Certainly today, felon disenfranchisement is a very effective tool, as well as voter ID. And I think that we do ourselves a disservice when we actually focus on one of them when they are all things that need to be combated.
And Rick, your thoughts on the efficacy of the various tactics?
So I guess I come at this a little bit differently in that when you think about what the problem is with these tactics and you focus on how, for example, they might affect election outcomes, as Hillary Clinton did when she claimed, for example, that voter ID laws were responsible for her loss in Wisconsin, I think you end up kind of missing the forest for the trees. And if you start getting into an empirical debate over whether suppressive tactics actually change election outcomes or affect turnout, then you get into a battle over the evidence. So for example, did Stacey Abrams lose her 2018 gubernatorial race because of the purges and the other things that were done by Brian Kemp, who was both running as her opponent in the election and running the election as Secretary of State in Georgia, if you're familiar with that example? I would say the better focus would be to ask this question: why should the state have the ability to make it harder for people to register and to vote? And so in a number of states, not all Republican states, some Republican states make it easy for people to vote, but in some Republican states, it's become harder to register and vote. And this is being defended in the name of preventing voter fraud. And what I try and show in the first chapter of Election Meltdown is that these charges are almost always unproven or vastly exaggerated. And neither voter confidence nor voter fraud really justify these laws. If you look at statistical studies of voter ID laws, one of the things you'll see is that they don't seem to have a big effect on turnout. But part of the reason for that is because all these steps are taken, all of this energy is put in to make sure that people can get over the hurdles that the state has put in front of them. And rather than put the energy into campaigning, energy is put into making sure voters can register and actually vote. And so a lot of the costs of these suppressive measures are hidden because they don't show up in statistical studies. And instead we should be asking, why doesn't society make it harder for states to put these barriers in place that are serving no good purpose?
Excellent. Mac, I didn't put this, I didn't let you know I was going to ask you this, but I can't help asking you. How did you go from Wall Street to deciding to make a film about voter suppression?
I've always thought voting was important, and it always frustrated me how few people in this country voted. And I always watched it out of the side of my vision through many years, actually decades. The Supreme Court passed a case, Shelby County versus Holder, in 2013 that gutted the Voting Rights Act. And that was shocking to me, knowing as little as I did. I did what I hadn't done in probably 30 years and read the opinion. And it struck me as inauthentic and dangerous because it declared essentially the Chief Justice that the era of racial discrimination in voting in the American South was substantially over. My wife is from Mississippi. I know that not to be true. And in the wake of Shelby in 2013, I watched states, many in the South, but not all in the South, begin to pass laws that substantially restricted the right of American citizens to register to vote or to vote. And I was, in retrospect, naively, I was shocked by that I thought we lived in a country where I don't know how you're going to vote, but I support vigorously, zealously your right to vote. Turns out that's no longer, if that was once the case, it is no longer the case. And I resolved, as a good ex-academic that I might be, to do research for a year or two and write a book on it, only to find that a number of people, Rick first among them, had just written fabulous books. Rick's The Fight to Vote was one of the books that I read in the first week of my research and concluded that I would add nothing to this, but maybe the story could be told to a broader audience. Maybe if the way people heard about this was actual stories of suppressed voters, turn this from an academic dialogue, turn it from a conceptual dialogue into the stories of American citizens denied the right to vote. And that's what our film is. In the course of making the film, I actually started to jot down different techniques of vote suppression. We cover 8 or 10 in the film, but I now have a document that goes on for pages and pages. And I agree with both Gilda and Rick to chase the minutia of this, to find the 41 things in the playbook. Tomorrow there will be 43. Right now, as we speak, there are a bunch of guys around a conference room table on K Street thinking of new ways to do this. And so if we beat them from last year, which we also need to do through litigation, through advocacy, through work at state legislatures, we're missing the forest for the trees. And the real issue here is every eligible citizen should have the right to vote, and states should protect that right, not hinder that right. That's where this dialogue needs to start.
God, I'm going to jump ahead in my questions that I sent you because I know people are very antsy to know, how is this pandemic going to affect the upcoming elections, both primary and very, very possibly the elections in November? And isn't voting by mail the answer? That's, I've voted by mail for so many times. It's so convenient. I love it. I'm like, hey, people, vote by mail. So your thoughts on vote by mail, your thoughts on how the COVID-19 might affect actually going to the polls. I'll start with Gilda. We'll go Gilda, Rick, and then Mac.
Okay, that's a lot.
I know it's a lot, but I know it's on people's mind.
So can I start with one of the hats that I wear is I'm the litigation director for an organization. The name of it is Advancement Project in the national office, and I'm the litigation director. And we filed a lawsuit in Florida prior to the presidential preference primary. And in that lawsuit, we challenged we actually challenged the election in that we were saying that the state needed to certainly make an adjustment for COVID-19. Because at that time, around March 17th, the country had been made aware of a pandemic, and there's a state of emergency, not only in the United States, but also in the state of Florida. So we first sent a letter to the governor and secretary of state, and then sued them saying, you need to extend the date for the receipt of vote by mail ballots and extend some additional deadlines. So we certainly saw that in that instance that the pandemic was certainly going to impact persons' abilities to access the right to vote, certainly for the presidential preference primary. We are still in litigation, and we have a trial date set for this case because we are continuing to demand that the state of Florida make adjustments to ensure that people have access to the right to vote by expanding early voting, having drop boxes, curbside voting, essentially many ways in which that people can have the right to vote. One of the ways that this pandemic can impact and certainly affect our right to vote, voter turnout, and voting methods is that today we can certainly work to ensure that people have the right to vote, because this pandemic is providing us an opportunity to prepare. And our preparation is coming through having to force states to think about November in May, right? In April, in March, April, and May, right? It's because we need to be prepared to vote, even if we can't get to the polls, or if only limited people can get to the polls. And certainly vote by mail is one of the ways. I do not think that vote by mail is the answer. I think it can be one of the answers, right? So not only do we need to expand vote by mail and have no excuse absentee balloting, we need to do other things. There's a major critique that I have of using vote by mail as the only method has to do with certainly one of the things that I talk about in my book, Uncounted: The Crisis of Voter Suppression, is the impact of the vote, right? How do people actually access the right to vote? And certainly in the African American culture, and certainly in communities of color, voting in person is a right that has been fought for, right? And people have died for it. And voting and certainly lower percentages of communities of color utilize vote by mail, right? So in order to, if there's a shift to vote by mail, and using that as the only method, there has to be education, right, to explain, right, this is just a request for an absentee ballot. It's not, then you still have to get the absentee ballot, and there's so many different rules that need to be attached. And people like my grandmother, who I use as a timeline in the book, right, saw voting certainly as an act of integrity. Right, so that's why you see in documentaries like Eyes on the Prize, where people are in line and being beaten, but they have on white button-down shirts and slacks and ties, and women have dresses and pocketbooks and hats, because it was an act of dignity. And so, the fight to vote was certainly it was a bloody one, but one that is certainly held in high honor. And I don't think people of color are willing to give that up, right? And people still there's still a high level of distrust in regards to vote by mail. And there are high rejection rates in communities of color of ballots, of ballots. We certainly saw that in Georgia with signature exact match issues. And so, this level of distrust, as well as this cultural shift that would certainly have to occur, is one of the primary reasons why I say that vote by mail can serve as one of the ways, but certainly I don't think particularly in states where it has not been the norm, that it can be one of the ways, but should not be the only way.
Okay. Rick, your thoughts on vote by mail? And I should also say that a lot of our viewers are wanting to know about Trump's threats directed just today at Nevada and Michigan he's threatening to withhold federal money to those states if they offer all their eligible citizen voters absentee ballots.
So
kind of crazy threat, but it's all kind of tied into this vote by mail thing.
Right. Well, first, let me say I want to thank Mac for saying praise about my earlier book, but the name of that earlier book was called The Voting Wars.
Voting Wars.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think my concerns about the election under the conditions of the pandemic fall into two categories. One is about voter disenfranchisement, and the other is about voter confidence. So I'm quite concerned that voters are going to have a tough time in some places being able to cast an effective vote in November. In a place like California, which already has 60 to 70% of its voters voting by mail, it's not going to be a big deal to shift to even more voters voting by mail. And California, the governor has announced that we're going to move in that direction, and every voter is going to be mailed a ballot. There will still be in-person voting available. And there are 5 states that do voting almost entirely by mail, including Utah and Colorado, Washington, and Oregon. But there are some places that have very little experience in voting by mail. So in Georgia, where they're about to hold their primary, delayed because of the pandemic, last time around, there were 36,000 people who requested vote by mail ballots. This time around, as of last month, 1.2 million people had requested absentee ballots, right? A huge surge, and it's not clear that election officials are going to be able to handle that surge. So one of the things we saw in the elections in both Ohio, which was slightly delayed, and in Wisconsin, where they went ahead with the election, huge surge in absentee ballot requests, and thousands of voters who requested absentee ballots but never received them in time. And those voters either had to go to the polling place and risk their health, or they were disenfranchised. We also know, before we even talked about the pandemic, that if you vote by mail, you are more likely to have your vote rejected by election officials than if you vote in person, because you might make a mistake with how you fill out the ballot. Your signature might be flagged as not matching. And we know that there's a racially disparate component to this. So in communities with large minority populations, ballots are tossed more. Some states have pretty good software that compares signatures from your DMV capture of your signature with the signature on the ballot. Other states do it by hand, and there's a lot of subjectivity. So I'm not generally a huge fan of absentee balloting. I prefer voting in person, but in the pandemic situation, vote by mail is going to be a key component, because it's not a choice of convenience versus a small risk of fraud. And I can talk about the fraud if you're interested. It's a choice between voters potentially risking their health or choosing not to vote. And the small risks of the process. So one of my concerns is about voter disenfranchisement. Even if we try and roll it out, there are states that don't have good experience with this, and it may not go smoothly. It won't go smoothly. And this brings me to the other concern, which is about voter confidence, and it brings up the president's comments today. In my book, Election Meltdown, I try to explain why American confidence in the fairness and legitimacy of elections and the vote counting process has been going down. Recent polling before the pandemic showed about 40% of voters not confident that the vote's going to be fairly constructed. And in the book, I give 4 reasons why this is occurring. One is voter suppression. One is pockets of incompetent election administration, which occurs in both Democratic and Republican jurisdictions. One is a set of dirty tricks, from the Russians engaging in the activities they did in 2016 to ballot tampering that we saw in the North Carolina 9th Congressional District in 2018. And then the last reason for my general concern is this increasingly incendiary rhetoric about rigged or stolen elections that convinces people that elections are not being done fairly. And so all of these concerns are now heightened by the pandemic, which is causing us to change our election rules at the last minute, to roll out new voting technology, to roll out new rules, to change our personnel, and to do it all under conditions where people already are polarized and angry and concerned. And the president just adds fuel to the fire when he makes unsubstantiated claims about voter fraud. He's been doing it for years. He claimed that without any evidence that there were 3 to 5 million non-citizens that voted in the 2016 election. He said all for his opponent, Hillary Clinton, a completely fabricated claim. Now he's switched to attacking vote by mail. And I think the reason he's doing it is he's trying to set the stage for, if he loses or if he stands to lose, that he could claim that it was the result of fraud. And here's one of my nightmare scenarios, and I'll end with this point and turn it back to you.
Nightmare.
We're going to have Michigan and Pennsylvania, 2 battleground states, for the first time ever have no excuse absentee balloting, like we have in California, meaning anybody who wants to vote by mail can vote by mail. That was in the works before the pandemic. Now it's going to really be taken advantage of. And I was already worried that what's going to happen is there's going to be a flood of absentee ballots. And we know places like Philadelphia and Detroit have a long history of poor election administration. They tried to do a recount in Detroit in 2016, and they couldn't even conduct it because the election was done so poorly. There's going to be this flood of absentee ballots, and there's not a lot of experience in counting these ballots. And so what's going to happen is we're going to have partial vote totals on election night. It's quite possible if the big cities are the places where they're behind in counting the votes that Trump is ahead. There may be 5 days where Trump is ahead. And in those 5 days, he might be claiming that all the later counted ballots are the result of fraud taking place in Democratic cities. He may claim to be the winner. And then 5 days later, Joe Biden is declared the winner. And there may be a fight over who gets the electoral college votes. And I could get into the details of that. But I think that Trump's constant complaining about voter fraud, the kind of the better explanation is that it's for his ego, so that if he loses, he can say that's why. But the more nefarious explanation is that it's laying the groundwork to contest the very election. And that makes me very concerned.
Mac, your thoughts on voting by mail, and also people are asking, as to the charge that voting by mail promotes voter fraud, is there evidence to counter that?
The evidence to counter that is the absence of material fraud prosecutions. Rick, I think, has mentioned 491 absentee ballot fraud cases in billions of ballots between maybe 2000 and 2012. And you've got to look at the data and say, if there's fraud, where is it? The biggest absentee ballot fraud case was in a congressional district in North Carolina in 2018, where the Republican candidate, his campaign was engaged in a ballot harvesting exercise that may have affected something around about 1,000 votes. The election was actually canceled based on that fraud and rerun. So can it happen? Yes. Is it generally caught? In my experience, yes. Let me add just a point or two to the thoughtful comments of both Gilda and Rick on the virus and voting this time. And I agree with what they've said, but I'm going to add 2 more. Think of voting administration as an industrial process, like getting food from the farm to the supermarket or manufacturing cars. You actually need to have good processes and good administration at every step of the way. And one of the many things that we learned in Wisconsin a few weeks ago is that when you have a virus that threatens people, especially older people, and we all know that many poll administrators are older, they don't show up or can't show up. So in Milwaukee County, the number of polling places went from 180 to 5. And so there were long lines and there were transportation difficulties, and it all happened at the last minute. And so the prediction of that, the controlling of that, the recruiting and training now of people who will show up, these are very, very difficult issues. They're logistical issues. Someone can choose to put a partisan veneer over them, but these are issues of industrial process management and administration. In states with low vote by mail percentages, they will be significant issues. And somehow each time this ball bounces, it seems to bounce against populations of color and poor people. They're the ones disenfranchised in Milwaukee County, where they used to walk to the polling place, but now they need public transportation. And guess what? It's not running that well during the virus. Whatever it is, it seems to go that way. I'm going to mention just one other thing on this, which is that the bad guys in this drama, the people seeking to deny some of our fellow citizens the right to vote, seem to be able to seize on these matters, and they're quite agile in grabbing trends. What do I mean? As the movement to have more vote by mail has gained force amongst all well-meaning election administrators, Republican or Democrat, some state legislatures have reacted in ways that put ridiculous barriers in front of it. There was a thought in Oklahoma in the legislature that the way to reduce fraud in absentee ballots, in vote by mail ballots, was to require a notarized signature on the ballot itself. Well, that's going to knock out many ballots, and certainly most ballots, from poor people. It's a ridiculous thing in the world of computer-aided signature matching. In Minnesota, the thought was that gaining 2 witnesses to attest to the veracity of the signature on the absentee ballot might achieve the same effect. And I'll close with just one more. In Texas, as people said, fear of COVID is a reason for me to ask for a ballot. There are words in the state law that give support to the argument that that's actually not allowable under state law in Texas. Texas has plenty of time to change it, but statewide Texas politicians are suggesting that they will fight and pursue someone who adopts that as an excuse where it's not authorized by Texas law. So the effort here is to, in my opinion, intimidate some people from voting and putting them into what we'll come to call the Wisconsin challenge, which is you can choose your health or your ballot, but you can't have both. So we need to just be vigilant of the agility of the other side to think of new ways to use these developments and fairly quickly to suppress the right to vote of Black and brown and poor populations.
Great. I want to go to Gilda because I know you want to mention something about voter fraud, and then we have a lot of interesting questions. So then I want to go to the questions. Go ahead,
Great.
Gilda.
So very quickly, and Mac, I want to add to your list, add Georgia to your list, which said that they were going to send out a request for absentee ballots to all of their voters, but they then also established a voter fraud task force and put prosecutors on the task force. It certainly as a way of intimidating. And this whole issue of whether vote by mail increases voter fraud is a distraction, right? Because we know that states that use vote by mail have encountered essentially 0 voter fraud. For example, in Oregon, which is certainly a pioneer here, has sent out more than 100 million mail-in ballots since 2000 and has documented only about a dozen cases of proven fraud. And when you round that to the 7th decimal point, that's 0.000000001% of all votes cast. And we also saw that in 2018, more than 31 million Americans cast votes by mail. And this idea that, so that's about 25% of election participants. So this whole idea that vote by mail is a problem or is problematic is because of, certainly it's not a voter fraud issue. I think it's a voter suppression issue. And that is because people, and Trump is making statements that you can't have vote by mail because then Republicans won't ever win. That's because, so when I was a deputy chief in the Civil Rights Division voting section, is when we first witnessed this idea that voter fraud was an issue, certainly that the United States government needed to pay attention to, and they created these task forces at that time within the DOJ, and made voter fraud an issue, and without evidence, and there's still no evidence of voter fraud, certainly little evidence of voter fraud. So Trump is essentially saying, and people who are opposed certainly to VBM and other expansions of the right to vote, they are essentially saying that voting is cheating, that allowing folk to vote or increasing the possibilities that people will actually vote. It's like they must be cheating in order, because they're voting, right? And so they are, and Mac is talking about the ways in which these opponents to access operate. Certainly, they are now actively fighting against access to the ballot. And so I think we do have to be aware of it. And then when you come from it from a fundamental viewpoint that, oh, if you're voting, you must be cheating. And that certainly recognizes that we having the right to vote expands the abilities for people to cast ballots, and that should be what we want in a democratic society.
Great. I think Rick, you wanted to make a quick comment, and then if you can make your answers a little shorter, because we have some great questions. I'd love to get to as many as possible. Go ahead, Rick.
I'll be quick. I agree with both Mac and Gilda that the absolute amount of absentee ballot fraud is quite low when you look at it across the country. That said, there are stories of absentee ballot fraud. There's one going on right now. You may not have heard about it. You probably haven't, but I'm guessing this is going to be a national story within a few days on Fox News. Paterson, New Jersey looks like a big absentee ballot fraud problem. Lots of ballots literally being stuffed into mailboxes, voters never receiving ballots. And why this matters is, even though this is a very rare circumstance, and this happened because this was an all-mail election being held because of COVID-19, these are going to get highlighted as evidence of widespread fraud. That is, you take the anecdote, you take the rare case, and you make it into something big. And something we haven't mentioned before, and I can't recall, it's been a while since I've seen Mac's movie, but the Republican National Committee since 1983 has been under a consent decree that has prevented it from engaging in so-called ballot security measures to intimidate voters at the polls. That consent decree, despite fights by Democrats, expired last year. And now we're talking about up to 50,000 people who are going to be organized to be poll watchers, who are going to be organized by the Republican Party, organized by the Trump campaign, and sent into mostly minority areas to intimidate minority voters, looking for so-called voter fraud. And they're going to use things like what's happening in Paterson, New Jersey as an excuse. And so forget the absolute amount of fraud, forget the logic. You can find a couple of stories. I mean, think about the new Black Panthers, if you remember this back in the early 2000s, that became covered on Fox News thousands of times. I mean, these small stories become huge and they take on a life of their own, kind of think like Benghazi. So just put it in perspective. It doesn't matter what the reality is. It matters what can be sold to Trump supporters.
Okay, great. Our next question, and this is a really important one. I'll start with you, Mac. What can the ordinary citizen do to help on this issue?
Number one, education, and number two, activism. Recognize voter fraud. Educate yourself on it. See it for what it is. Recognize it for what it is. These laws are frequently offered to people as benign, merely administrative provisions, but in fact, their animus is to reduce the franchise. These laws are almost always passed at the state level. And so state legislatures matter. That's also, by the way, where gerrymandering takes place. We haven't talked much about that today. And election administration is largely state by state at the county level. And so local activism and local vigilance and local knowledge and education of our fellow citizens would be my prescription.
Great. Here's a question. Is there evidence to confirm Trump's assertion that if everybody voted, no Republican would ever win again?
Well, I can take that one.
Okay.
The answer to that is no. One example is Utah, which has all vote by mail, and they regularly elect Republicans. Historically, as I'm sure Californians know, vote by mail was used much more by Republicans. And the reason for that is if you're older, white, don't move because you own a home, you're more likely to be both a Republican and a vote by mail voter, because you can just have permanent absentee status and get your ballot sent to you every election. In the last dozen years, or maybe a little bit longer, Democrats have started moving towards pushing early in-person and absentee voting as part of their Get Out the Vote campaign. The idea is, if we know we got someone to vote, we can scratch them off our list and we can help try to get someone else to vote, rather than doing it all on election day. And so now there's about parity between Democrats and Republicans in using vote by mail. That's not necessarily the pattern we're going to see in November, because everything's off because of the pandemic. But generally speaking, the social science studies show there is no bias towards one side or the other. But Trump seems to think that anything that makes voting easier is going to hurt him. So the larger the electorate, he thinks, the worse it's going to be for him. I don't know if that's true or not, but generally speaking, there's not a bias against Republicans with vote by mail. Historically, if anything, it's been the opposite.
Right, no bias, but if he's thinking about the popular vote and that he lost the popular vote, there certainly may be more people who would vote if you go by mail. That margin might be even larger. I don't know.
Here's an interesting question. It says, will Trump's assault on the U.S. Postal Service impact voting by mail?
Trump's
ahead.
assault, meaning his
Assault on the U.S. Postal, he would love to just eliminate the U.S. Postal Service and make it all privatized.
Let me frame this one. The Postal Service is short on money, needs reauthorization of, and may need to adjust its rates. But if voting by mail goes up by tens of millions of pieces, the Postal Service may be overwhelmed in some places. There's also an issue in different states about, does a mail-in ballot count if it's postmarked by Election Day or if it's received by Election Day? And so in received by Election Day states, which are substantial, this is one of the issues litigated in Wisconsin. If there is a state where a ballot has to be received by Election Day and the Postal Service is overwhelmed, tens of thousands of people could be disenfranchised by that. It won't shock you to hear that somehow people of color end up on the short end of this one. Their ballots seem somehow to take longer to get to the Board of Elections. And if they are postmarked on Election Day and arrive 3 days later, 5 days later, you get into what Rick was talking about, which was what Trump did in Florida in 2018, which is if his boys ahead after a day or two start pounding the drum to shut down the counting because every vote coming in now must be fraudulent. So this depends on the postal system, and the postal system is frail. And 6 months from now, it may be more frail.
Wow, that's
right,
interesting.
and the postmark date is certainly something that's being litigated in several states right now. So we may be able to say postmark date as opposed to receipt. But if vote by mail is expanded, I think as Rick was saying earlier, we may not know who the president is on Election Day, right? And we may need to start just kind of wrapping our minds around that as we move forward.
Yeah, I would also add that, to the extent that Trump is going to go after the Postal Service, this is going to hurt rural Trump supporting voters more than anyone else, because the Postal Service has been a lifeline in small rural communities. And you think it's going to be cheaper to get your goods sent by UPS or FedEx to these rural areas? It would be terrible. And this is a point I made in my op-ed in the Washington Post today about making vote by mail harder. What we saw in Wisconsin was that Republicans had a hard time getting their vote by mail ballots in that election. You had a state Supreme Court race where the Democratic-backed candidate won by a large margin. And part of the reason for that was Republicans didn't have their act together with vote by mail. Republican voters are being told that vote by mail is not secure, and so they may end up using vote by mail less. And so it's really a self-inflicted wound, and I think it kind of belies the idea that Trump is this evil genius when he's making these claims. I think, he's just flailing for anything that will make it harder for people to vote because he thinks that's in his benefit. And I don't think it goes any further than that.
Here's an interesting question. Is there any evidence that Russians are involved in voter fraud? Voter fraud. We know they have, in fact, influenced the election in terms of the internet ads and so forth. But how about voter fraud?
So back in 2016, the Russians did three things. The one that gets the most attention is the hacking of the Democratic Party emails. The second thing is the social media manipulation. A lot of those social media messages were aimed at African Americans to try to get them to not turn up to vote at all, and were aimed at Trump supporters to claim that there's a lot of voter fraud. But the thing that gets the least attention, that was maybe the most troubling of all of this, was that all 50 states saw their voter registration databases probed by the Russian government. And this is in the report of the intelligence community. And no votes were changed. This is a voter registration issue. But you can imagine if you could hack the voter registration database and change people's information when they go to vote, and the state goes to check their registration status, it would show that they're not eligible to vote, and it would be havoc. But I'm actually less worried about that because now DHS and state and local authorities are working on this issue. Here's what I'm much more worried about, and I spin out this scenario in my book, Election Meltdown. What if there's a cyber attack on the electrical grid in a Democratic city like Detroit in a swing state, power goes out. People can't get to the polling place. On top of a pandemic, right? It could really wreak havoc. So we're always fighting the last war. I'm worried about the kinds of things that the Russians could do or others could do to our infrastructure that could affect the ability to safely vote on election day.
Interesting. Here's a good question. A pessimist asks, what if several days after the election, 3 or 4 states are undecided and Trump declares election fraud? Where does it get litigated and what will be the outcome? I don't know if we can predict that. I'm sure it depends on what state and all that kind of thing, but a pessimist, what if several days after the election, 3 or 4 states are undecided?
Well, I was in the Department of Justice in the room when it happened in 2000
Oh my God.
with Bush v. Gore, when we realized that we didn't have one person in the state of Florida, right? But we had persons dispatched throughout the United States, but not one person in the state of Florida. So where will it play out? I think that certainly has a lot to do with where things may happen. And right now, you certainly have both political parties as well as advocacy groups that are geared up and preparing for the fight that will certainly be come November, to ensure that all votes are cast and votes are cast and the votes are counted, certainly in a way that they are intended. So I think the best that we can do right now is to be vigilant. And I think that if there is a fight, that it may well end up the same way as the Bush v. Gore fight. And that one started in the states, started in the state courts and ended up in the United States Supreme Court. So that could well be the path that challenges would take in the future.
Another question. What are the chances that a significant voting reform bill will pass in Congress?
Zero.
That means before the
Zero.
that was your shortest, most clear answer yet. Not clear. Answer
Maybe
always,
after the election.
most blunt answer yet.
No, Val,
maybe after,
just to be full on it, there were 2 very significant voting bills passed by the House in the last session. H.R. 1, which was an omnibus bill on many elements of our democracy, and H.R. 4, which was the Voting Rights Act renewal legislation. Both were passed in the House and are sitting gathering dust on Mitch McConnell's desk. So only if all 3 elements of our process changed would any of these things advance. Therefore, I again direct people to activity at the states where real progress can be made. And I'd remind everyone that this is a redistricting year. The 2020 census flows into a 2020, 2021
right.
redistricting process, which will have profound implications. One of the things we cover in the film was a successful Republican, the Republican state legislative conference went around to big donors and said, I can change 25 seats in the Congress without earning 1 extra vote if you give us $35 million to win some state legislative races and conduct gerrymandering on top of that. And that's what they did, 25 seats without changing an additional vote. And so the profundity of the strength of that, we can't forget that. We can't get into bickering about, hey, you've closed this polling location, talk about losing the forest for the trees. Gerrymandering is immensely powerful and has created situations. I'm going to go back to Wisconsin, where in the 2018 state legislative elections, I won't get these numbers exactly right, but well over 50%, maybe 54%, Rick and Gilda, you may know the answer, of the votes were cast for Democratic candidates for the state legislature, but through gerrymandering, over 65% of those seats went to Republicans. So if you believe in democracy, that will trouble you. And it won't shock anyone to hear that the most focused comes on that in the swing states, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Florida, Georgia, etc., this is an immensely important process.
All right, I'm going to ask for final thoughts, but one final question, which is very good. What groups, are there any particular groups that are especially effective in terms of fighting this issue? I'm not talking about the right side, but on the left. The documentary, which by the way, there's a link to the documentary that will be available after this, will be on the website, be available to be watched if you haven't seen the documentary. So now the question is, the documentary looks at all the groups that are organized to suppress the vote. Are there any particular groups on the other side that are very effective in fighting them? It kind of goes to that, what can we citizens do? Is there an organization or group we can support who's effective in fighting voter suppression?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. There are a number of ways that people can help. So I always tell people to do three things: educate, legislate, litigate. And certainly, you know, as Max said, educate ourselves about what these voting laws are and how they impact us, and educate others. Be aware of legislation and actually help to try to change legislation, and then litigate. And there are a number of organizations that litigate, like Advancement Project, as well as NAACP, LDF, MALDEF, Demos, Latino Justice, CURLDA, all certain SPLC, Southern Poverty Law Center, they all work in the area. And there's also election protection, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, of course, and working with election protection, where people can volunteer to work on election day to ensure that people have access to the right to vote, and can also, and in that way can actually make sure that, you know, people have a voice to try to help correct situations as they occur.
Right. Final thoughts from all of you. Looking ahead, this is unprecedented. It would have been unprecedented anyway, and then COVID-19 comes along and adds a whole nother layer of complexity and unpredictability to this. So what are your final thoughts looking forward to a, what can you call it? Could be, you know, all the words, adjectives are not quite enough. It could be chaos, but it's also probably the single most important election we've had in modern history. So what are your final thoughts as we look forward to the politics during COVID-19?
I can go election first. So, you know, the perspective that you'll read in my book, as well as my perspective, is that this is not new, right? And having these challenges to the ballot are certainly not new in communities of color, and certainly not new to this country. The right to vote has often been siphoned onto only certain groups of people. And, you know, started out with the founding fathers with only being available to white men who own property, right? And it's only been in the last 50 or so years, where we've had the right to vote to all people, right? To people, the citizens of the United States. So 50 years in the history of our country. So it's not new. And so the challenges that we faced are not new, and they're ones, but I think it's important to understand that they are challenges that we can meet and that we must meet. And certainly forums like this helps everyone to understand that these are not challenges that we cannot overcome, and that we will overcome. And it's important to certainly, all the resources here, you know, my book and Rick's book and Rigged as the movie certainly helped educate, so that we are aware of the practices that have existed and that will continue to exist, and that we have the tools that are available to us to ensure that we can have the right to vote, certainly for it, and hopefully at some point in our existence, see what a real democracy is supposed to, how a real democracy is supposed to operate.
Great. Rick, and then Mac.
So when I got to the end of writing Election Meltdown, I realized that while I had some what I think are pretty good medium and long-term solutions to our problems of our elections, in the short term, we're really facing a huge crisis. And it's a crisis that needs solutions in law, politics, media, and tech. And so I put together an ad hoc committee called the Ad Hoc Committee on 2020 Fairness and Legitimacy. And we just issued a report called Fair Elections During a Crisis. You can Google that and you'll find the report. And we came up with 14 recommendations for things that election administrators should do, that the media should do. One of the key recommendations of the media should be educating the public now that it may be days before we know who the next president is, and that
Very important.
too early to call is the right message, and that like a fine wine, a good election count takes time. And so what we really need to do is what the average person can do, to come back to your early question as well, look at these 14 recommendations, push the social media companies to remove disinformation about voting, push your local election officials to have a plan B in case there is a cyber attack on the elections. And so look at those recommendations. There's a lot that the public can do to try to make people who are in power, who control the different things that affect election legitimacy, do the right thing.
Great. Mac, your final thoughts?
Val, I'll give you 3 words, and they all begin with P. Be perceptive, be persistent, and be patient. So be perceptive, recognize these benign administrative changes for what they may be, which is an effort to suppress the vote. Be perceptive on these allegations of widespread voter fraud, be it vote by mail ballots or in-person ballots, and ask for evidence. And when there is none, then call the allegation of fraud, the fraud itself, what Rick calls the fraudulent fraud squad. So be perceptive. You'll read Rick or Gilda's book, you'll see our film, and you'll understand what's been done out there. Be persistent in that they're going to keep coming. They try to suppress the vote because it works. And if you cannot create a bigger tent, then you need to make the other guy's tent smaller. And so we need to be persistent in zealously guarding every day. We need to wake up every day ready to fight, because the right to vote will not just prosper on its own. It needs to be fostered and defended. And finally, be patient. We have to be rigged in here for a long game. When the election happens, the bad guys may try to call the game on account of darkness at a point to their advantage. And let's wait until every vote is reasonably counted. It'll just be a matter of days. Bush v. Gore was a month. I hope we don't have that, but I think it's fairly likely that in 2, 3, 4 states, this will drag on and everybody in the country will be screaming for it to be over, but we need to get the right answer. And so be patient. So be perceptive, be persistent, and please be patient.
That's great advice. And I think the other great advice is getting the word out for people now, so people will expect that it's going to take way longer than normal. So they won't think that something weird is happening at the last minute. If they tell them ahead of time, be ready for a week or 2 before anything is settled, that will really solve a lot of problems. We also want to mention that the link to the documentary will be sent to all the participants, all you participants out there. We will be sending you a link to the documentary. I think I also saw a link that Rick sent to the report. And and also a list of all the organizations that are working in this field. So all you folks here who joined us, more than 400 participants, and I'm sure there's more people because oftentimes there's more than one participant. Thank you so much. I hope you found this valuable, and there's a lot of work to be done, but we have the expertise, and we certainly have the motivation when we're all committed, I think, to fair elections and democracy. And I'm going to pass the mic, so to speak, on to Janice Kamener-Resnick. She is chair of Jews United for Democracy and Justice. Janice?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Val. Thank you, Rick. Thank you, Mac and Gilda. We could not have presented a more time-appropriate program, and we could not have done it with better speakers. Thank you all for being with us tonight. We will be sending you links to Rick's book, to Gilda's book, to the film, and to the report that Rick mentioned. And we're also going to try to gather various advocacy, voter suppression links to be able to send out over the next couple of days. And I just want to make a quick announcement about our next program. Next week, we have some very exciting, a very exciting program with Max Boot and Pat Morrison at 5 o'clock next Wednesday. And the following Wednesday, we have David Brooks with Warren Olney. Then after that, David Frum and Peter Beinart with Madeline Brand. And then on June 24th, we have the deans of UCLA and UC Berkeley Law Schools. That's Erwin Chemerinsky, Jennifer Mnuchin, speaking about the Constitution in Crisis. And next week, we'll be announcing 2 more very exciting new programs that we're adding to the program. A final note, 10,000 Americans have died of COVID-19 since last week. And our hearts go out to those who are in mourning. And we wish you all a good week, a healthy week. Stay home, stay safe. And see you next week at 5 o'clock with Max Boot and Pat Morrison. Thanks for being with us.